The first alert to local authorities didn't come from a search team or law enforcement. It came from a passerby, a civilian who had no official involvement in the search effort. This individual had noticed something unusual, even disturbing, near the edge of an isolated property tucked away from the main roads. Within a matter of hours, sheriff's deputies were dispatched to the scene. Every movement was deliberate, guided by standard protocol designed to avoid contamination of anything that might prove crucial to the investigation. As the team pushed further into the secluded area and conducted a more thorough examination of the site, they made a chilling discovery. Silence hung over the team as the reality of what they'd found began to settle in. Though formal identification had not yet been made, the growing belief that the victim could be Maddie cast a heavy shadow over everyone present. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Today, in this documentary, we'll take a look at real photos and dive into the true story of Maddie Kingsbury, who was born on June 1, 1996 in Minnesota, United States. Maddie was, by all accounts, a bright, compassionate young woman whose life was woven together by the close-knit fabric of her family, her devotion to her 2 children, and the bustling routines of a small city perched along the rolling waterways of southeastern Minnesota. She was born into a family that prized warmth and connection, and from an early age, Maddie exhibited a remarkable sensitivity toward others. Friends recalled that she never hesitated to be the first to help if someone was struggling, whether it was a classmate who needed guidance on a difficult assignment or a neighbor dealing with an emergency. Her teachers consistently noted how engaged she was in her studies, describing her as equally inquisitive and caring, a rare combination that allowed her to excel not just academically but socially, forging lasting bonds with those around her. Growing up in Winona meant she was surrounded by sweeping bluffs, winding rivers, and a community oriented around a mix of agricultural heritage and local industries. In this environment, Maddie developed a love for the outdoors, often taking scenic walks or quick hikes on weekends with friends and family. As she moved through adolescence, Maddie's circle of friends expanded, and she seamlessly navigated the usual teenage challenges with a blend of humor and resilience. While she wasn't one to draw attention to herself, she had a quiet confidence that came across in her kind smile and her readiness to listen when people needed to talk. Many of her closest friends would later reflect on that warmth as one of the defining traits that made her impossible to forget. After finishing high school, she took her natural curiosity about the human body and parlayed it into studies that would eventually open doors in a medical or health-related field. Over the years, as she balanced her responsibilities, Maddie also carved out a personal life that revolved around the people who mattered most to her. In photos, she appeared with a gentle smile, her eyes reflecting a certain mixture of warmth and determination that endeared her to viewers. It was in these everyday moments that she cultivated a sense of stability and calm, especially once she became a mother. By her mid-20s, Maddie was raising 2 children, which naturally shifted her priorities in powerful ways. Her days started early, as she diligently rose to prepare breakfast, pack lunches, and ensure that her children had everything they needed for the day ahead. Weekends might find her running errands with them, squeezing in time for an afternoon at a local park, or reading bedtime stories before tucking them in at night. Though being a parent demanded much of her energy, she also made room for the little bursts of happiness that came from personal hobbies. As her children grew, her commitment to offering them both stability and enrichment became even more apparent. She talked about their futures and what the world might have in store for them, gently encouraging early curiosity and good manners. The people closest to Maddie noticed that motherhood imbued her with a renewed sense of focus, and even in moments of stress, she carried herself with composure and an unwavering desire to do right by her family. While she valued her role as a mother, she also recognized the importance of staying connected to her own aspirations. She spoke about seeking potential career advancements, possibly enrolling in more specialized training or taking on responsibilities at work that would allow her to sharpen her expertise. Still, life in a small city like Winona isn't always tranquil, and Maddie experienced her share of frustrations and heartbreaks, though they were rarely shared publicly. The balancing act of work demands, parenting, and personal life inevitably led to the occasional moment of feeling stretched too thin. On what began as a seemingly ordinary Friday morning in late March, Maddie Kingsbury's day unfolded with the efficient rhythm that characterized much of her life. She rose early, prepared her children's things for daycare, and exchanged light-hearted messages with friends about weekend plans. She had to drop off her little ones and then head to her job. But as the midday hours approached, an unsettling sense began to creep over the people closest to her. Normally, Maddie would check in via text, sometimes a short message about an upcoming appointment or a reminder about pickup times. However, on this particular day, her phone went silent. Hours trickled by, and concerned family members tried calling, but her phone went straight to voicemail or simply didn't ring at all. In a matter of moments, routines that had always felt comforting and predictable suddenly took on a shadowy cast. Something was off. Friends who had been in regular contact noticed the abrupt end to the lively banter they often shared. And by that evening, anxiety among her loved ones was palpable. Some reached out to one another, hoping for reassurance that there was a simple explanation. Maybe she'd lost her phone or was stuck in an unexpected meeting at work. But as the evening gave way to night and no one had heard from her, the concern escalated from worry into a gnawing fear that something far more troubling might have happened. By the following morning, family members and close friends had gathered, trading theories, retracing her last known movements, and making frantic calls to local hospitals, just in case there had been some kind of accident. Nobody could recall a time Maddie had ever gone completely off the grid without telling someone where she was going, especially considering the responsibilities she had as a mother. It was precisely that maternal bond and her dependable nature that made her sudden absence so troubling. Where could she possibly be? It was with a trembling voice that one of her relatives finally made the call to law enforcement, reporting her missing. The next few hours would see a flurry of activity as local authorities collected preliminary information, combing through any clue that might shed light on her whereabouts. Officers arrived at Maddie's home, a place typically filled with the laughter of children and the comforting hum of daily life, only to find it eerily silent. Nothing immediately appeared ransacked. There was no obvious sign of a break-in. But there was also no indication of a planned trip. No packed suitcase, no note left behind. Maddie's car was in the driveway, her purse in the house. Her cell phone was unresponsive, and it soon became clear that she hadn't taken her wallet or any other essentials. Investigators took careful note of the meticulously arranged children's belongings, the half-finished grocery list on the kitchen counter, and other signs that suggested a routine day had been abruptly cut short. Within a day or two, news of Maddie's disappearance began to ripple through Winona. Although the community was no stranger to life's hardships, the notion that a vibrant young mother could vanish without explanation struck an especially painful chord among residents. Social media posts spread the word, urging everyone to keep an eye out for any sign of her, whether in town or the surrounding rural areas. Concerned citizens printed flyers bearing her photograph, distributing them to local businesses, gas stations, and neighborhood bulletin boards. In these initial days, the hope was that she had simply gone off the grid, maybe needing a break or sorting out a personal crisis. But as more time passed, that optimism started to dim. The thought of Maddie willingly leaving her children behind felt incomprehensible. Still, her circle of friends refused to succumb to the worst-case scenarios right away. They organized small search groups, coordinating with local law enforcement. Some scoured the roadsides leading into and out of the city, while others checked local hiking trails or parks she was known to frequent. Police officers, meanwhile, began gathering any digital traces that could help. Phone records, bank statements, and even a timeline of her social media usage. Officers questioned neighbors about the last time they saw her. Had there been any suspicious cars parked nearby? Any unusual visitors in the neighborhood that morning? Bit by bit, each conversation added a small piece to the puzzle, but it still remained agonizingly incomplete. The local authorities marshaled volunteers who answered the call in impressive numbers. People from neighboring towns, some of whom had never met Maddie, joined in. Winona's terrain, with its mix of urban spaces and more remote rural areas, made the search both challenging and time-consuming. Groups with flashlights and bright vests fanned out along local trails and the banks of the river. Law enforcement set up a coordination center, mapping out search routes that would systematically cover the region. Community members used social media to organize meeting points, share tips, and post updates about where they had searched and what they had found. While a few leads poured in here and there, someone thought they'd seen a woman matching Maddie's description at a rest stop outside town. Someone else was convinced they had a sighting near a local supermarket. None of these tips panned out. A sense of mounting frustration grew each time another lead vanished into a dead end. Through it all, Maddie's family made public pleas for her safe return. They stood in front of news cameras, their voices filled with tremors of desperation and unwavering love. The heartbreak was visible in their eyes, but so too was an undercurrent of steadfast belief that Maddie would come home. They urged anyone with information to step forward, no matter how insignificant that information might seem. For many, the family's calls for help added an intensely human dimension to the tragedy. This wasn't just a headline. It was a mother, a daughter, a friend. Each day brought a fresh wave of worry. The children continued to ask for their mother, and the family could only offer reassurances that everyone was doing their very best to bring her back. In the background, investigators quietly pieced together a timeline of Maddie's last known hours. They confirmed that she had successfully dropped off her children at daycare that morning, spoke with a coworker by phone, and may have returned home for a brief interval. But after that point, the narrative became hazy. Some neighbors reported hearing a car door slam around mid-morning. Others noted nothing out of the ordinary. Surveillance footage from nearby streets was sparse, and nothing conclusive turned up on traffic cameras or local security systems. The local police department sought assistance from state authorities, hoping that specialized resources like aerial searches or advanced digital forensics might yield a breakthrough. Helicopters hovered over areas of dense woodland that were tough to navigate on foot, their powerful searchlights sweeping across tree lines and open fields alike. Despite these considerable efforts, day after day ended with the grim realization that they were still no closer to finding Maddie. While the public face of the investigation showed unwavering resolve, behind the scenes, officers admitted the difficulty of the situation. This wasn't a case with easy leads, such as suspicious transactions on a bank card or phone pings from a distant city. Instead, it seemed to be a disappearance with no clear trail. In a tight-knit community like Winona, it was inconceivable to many that anyone could vanish so completely. Tensions rose, especially on social media, where rumors and speculation proliferated. Some online commentators shared theories about foul play, pointing fingers at individuals close to Maddie. Others questioned whether she had arranged her own disappearance, though those who knew her vehemently dismissed the idea, citing her deep ties to her children and her stable working life. In the midst of this digital maelstrom, local law enforcement urged restraint, cautioning against vigilante theories and public accusations. They emphasized that real investigations require patience, a careful sifting of evidence, and respect for due process. The community responded, for the most part, by rallying behind the family and continuing to volunteer in the search. Each day ended with group debriefings, where volunteers recounted which specific sectors had been canvassed and what items had been found. A stray shoe, a discarded sweater, a piece of plastic that might have come from a cell phone case. In most instances, these objects bore no link to Maddie, but the searchers held on to the faint hope that they were getting closer. Even so, the strain on all involved was evident. After weeks of fruitless searching, the anguish surrounding Maddie Kingsbury's disappearance continued to spread through the community like a slow, heavy fog. Volunteers who had once eagerly turned out in droves each morning found themselves wrestling with exhaustion, yet they persisted, driven by a determination to bring closure to her family. Law enforcement maintained a consistent presence across Winona and its surrounding rural areas, systematically rechecking any leads that might have fallen through the cracks. By now, every wooded trail, every abandoned building, and every cluster of farmlands had been scrutinized at least once, if not multiple times. Rumors and theories churned in the background. Some speculated that Maddie might have traveled far beyond the local region. Others whispered about potential foul play, though no concrete evidence had emerged to confirm such a theory. For her loved ones, each passing day increased the dread that they might never uncover answers. Yet within a matter of weeks, a discovery came to light in a place that many had only cursorily reviewed. A quiet corner of Fillmore County marked by dense tree cover and winding back roads. For the investigators who responded, the location was a grim testament to just how easily a life could be hidden away from sight. Local authorities had first been tipped off by a passerby, someone who wasn't even part of an organized search team but had ventured off the beaten path for personal reasons. The person noticed something unsettling near the edge of a secluded property. At first, they dismissed it as the result of storm runoff or animal activity, yet a nagging intuition compelled them to look closer. Recognizing that this could be relevant to Maddie's case, or perhaps another missing person situation, they promptly phoned the local sheriff's office. Within hours, uniformed deputies arrived, accompanied by crime scene specialists who set up a wide perimeter to preserve potential evidence. Though the area itself wasn't sprawling, the thick canopy cast a perpetual dusk over the site. The hush of the forest was broken only by muted conversations among law enforcement officials, the beep of forensic equipment, and the occasional chirp of wildlife disturbed by the human intrusion. In the initial moments, there was no certainty about whose might be there, but a solemn air descended over the searchers, as though they collectively braced for what they might find. Methodically, crime scene technicians began to clear away layers of foliage and brush, guided by an established protocol to minimize the risk of contaminating vital evidence. It didn't take long for them to make a preliminary identification that this was indeed a potential site. As they descended deeper and examined the crime scene more closely, they discovered a person. The reaction was instantaneous and deeply sobering. Faces that had been set in determined focus now bore the weight of sorrow. Even without formal identification, the possibility that it was Maddie deeply unsettled everyone present. Officers called in more specialized units, including forensic anthropologists, to handle this sensitive task with the utmost care and respect. The area was cordoned off even further, keeping the circle of authorized personnel as tight as possible, both out of respect for the victim and to ensure an uncontaminated investigation. News spread quickly that a person had been found near the Winona County border. Information spread not only within law enforcement channels, but also on social media, where local residents who had been following Maddie's story from the beginning latched onto this new development. Concerned citizens, plagued by equal parts fear and hope, flooded the official tip line with questions and offers of help. The general refrain was hauntingly consistent. Please let it not be her. But if it is, at least her family can have answers. Local reporters, well aware of the public's interest, kept a respectful distance from the scene, but provided measured updates. Humans have been discovered in a remote area, and officials are working to confirm the identity. Behind these cautious statements, there was an unspoken tension. This was possibly the most significant lead in the entire case. Everyone recognized that a formal identification could forever alter the narrative that had thus far been marked by worry and speculation. Forensic teams worked meticulously. Under the dappled light penetrating the canopy, they photographed, logged, and collected everything in the immediate vicinity. Pieces of clothing that might have withstood the elements, fragments of personal items, even soil samples for further analysis. Each artifact was placed in a sealed container, labeled with precise location data, then sent for laboratory testing. The process was slow and deliberate, in stark contrast to the frantic searches of the previous weeks. Investigators knew that a single oversight here could jeopardize the integrity of the entire case. They also knew that the family was hanging on the edge of uncertainty, desperate for a final confirmation or denial. While most of the public would only see a few brief news clips summarizing these procedures, the gravity of the situation was deeply felt by anyone who stepped foot on that cordoned-off patch of earth. Once enough evidence had been collected at the scene, were respectfully transported to the medical examiner's office for a thorough identification process. Specialists in forensic pathology and forensic odontology were consulted. Dental records, DNA samples, and other biographical markers would eventually be used to determine the victim's identity with as much certainty as possible. During the days it took for these tests to be run, tension mounted in Winona and beyond. People gathered in small groups at local diners, whispering in hushed tones about the site of the discovery. Family members, close friends, and community volunteers who had poured their hearts into the search tried to maintain composure, while privately preparing themselves for the most likely outcome. If this evidence belonged to Maddie, it meant a tragic end to a weeks-long hope that she might still be alive somewhere. If the evidence turned out to belong to someone else, it would mean the town still had no answers about what became of her, leaving them back at square one, a fate nearly as agonizing. During this interim, law enforcement issued measured statements, avoiding speculation. They advised the community that while a discovery had been made, official identification was still pending. Their subdued caution spoke volumes. Few believed they would go to such lengths if there weren't strong indicators connecting to Maddie. At the family's request, members of the public maintained a respectful distance from the site and refrained from overloading social media with unverified claims. Nevertheless, the conversation was impossible to contain entirely. Some online discussions ventured into theories about who might have been responsible for placing Maddie in such a remote spot. Others questioned how thorough the original search of that area had been, or why the evidence were only discovered weeks after she disappeared. Conspiracy theories bloomed, as they often do in high-profile missing person cases. But local law enforcement consistently urged everyone to let the investigative process unfold without interference. A little over a week after we're discovered, the medical examiner's office released a preliminary identification. It was indeed Maddie Kingsbury. While further forensic examinations were necessary to determine how she happened and whether any additional evidence could be recovered from the crime scene, one heartbreaking fact has now been made public. The missing mother, whose face became a symbol of grief in Winona, will not be coming home. The news spread across the city in a wave of sorrow and reluctant acceptance. Those who had steadfastly believed in her safe return felt the impact of reality. Friends and relatives offered public and private messages of condolence, referencing the shining aspects of Maddie's life, her devotion, her warmth, her bright future, while struggling to comprehend the magnitude of this loss. In an official press conference, the police chief stood before a podium with a heavy heart, articulating the feelings that had permeated the force since day one of the investigation. Confirming Maddie's identity brought a sense of closure to one pressing question, he noted. But it also ignited a new determination to learn what truly happened. The chief refused to give specific details about the manner of death, citing the ongoing investigation and the respect owed to Maddie's family. Meanwhile, the district attorney hinted that this case had been a top priority from the outset, and that now, with the discovery of her, the urgency to identify possible perpetrators was even higher. In the aftermath of the grim discovery that confirmed Maddie Kingsbury's fate, the investigation pivoted with renewed urgency toward identifying who was responsible and concealing it so deliberately. While the public, and even some members of law enforcement, had harbored early suspicions, no single piece of evidence was initially strong enough to trigger an immediate arrest. Yet as forensic specialists pieced together findings from the scene in Fillmore County, investigators also circled back to individuals who had known Maddie intimately. Among these, Adam Fravel, the father of her children and reportedly the last person to see her alive, came under intensified scrutiny. In the earliest stages of the search, Adam had publicly professed concern for Maddie's well-being, but elements of his behavior raised quiet, persistent questions among authorities. Some neighbors recalled inconsistent remarks he had made about the day of her disappearance, while others noted a tension in his demeanor that seemed more guarded than simply grief-stricken. Still, law enforcement refrained from making any swift judgments, aware that a hunch or suspicion was not the same as proof. Once Maddie's were identified, however, officers obtained warrants to collect comprehensive digital data, from phone communication logs to email exchanges, as well as to conduct a thorough forensic examination of the shared residence and any vehicles associated with him. In that process, they unearthed troves of text messages that hinted at mounting disagreements in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, some involving finances, others touching on the relationship's deteriorating trust. More pivotal phone location records painted a pattern that was difficult to explain innocently. Adam's device appeared to linger in the vicinity of the property in Fillmore County around the critical time frame when Maddie was believed to have been there. Furthermore, the car he regularly drove showed microscopic traces of evidence that forensic analysts suspected to be consistent with the site where Maddie's was ultimately recovered. Though the details remained largely confidential at first, word spread that investigator had compiled a substantial circumstantial case. This spurred a wave of speculation online and in local circles, with the city of Winona itself seeming to hold its breath in the days before any formal charges were announced. The public, still reeling from the heartbreak of learning Maddie's fate, now demanded accountability, and many expressed alarms at the notion that someone she had once trusted could be implicated in her death. During press conferences, the police chief acknowledged the delicate balance between maintaining investigative integrity and addressing the community's urgent pleas for information. The break many had been waiting for came when law enforcement officially named Adam Fravel a person of interest and then, within a short span, effected his arrest. A hush spread over the city when officers escorted him away in handcuffs, a stark image that confirmed the suspicions that had simmered for weeks. Officially, he was charged with second-degree murder, a step authorities took because of the evidence they had on hand at the time. The district attorney, in a carefully worded statement, noted that the charge could be elevated depending on the final results of forensic analyses and additional testimonial evidence. In the days following his arrest, Adam appeared in court wearing the same expression of subdued anxiety he'd displayed from the beginning. Though he pleaded not guilty, the judge ruled that he should be held without bail, citing the severity of the allegations and the potential flight risk. From there, the pre-trial phase became a meticulous process of building or contesting the prosecution's case. Prosecutors combed through hours of phone records, digital correspondence, and witness statements. They also leaned on forensic breakthroughs, including soil samples found on Adam's clothing and in the trunk of his vehicle, which, according to expert testimony, could be matched to the exact environment of the wooded patch where evidence was discovered. Defense attorneys countered that many items of evidence were circumstantial and that the presence of certain materials in a car trunk did not necessarily point to guilt. However, prosecutors anticipated such arguments and introduced location data that placed Adam's phone in suspiciously precise correlation with the location. They compiled a timeline of events that encompassed not only the morning of Maddie's disappearance, but also the subsequent days, during which Adam's digital footprint appeared painstakingly quiet. Combined with the earlier messages that suggested tension in the relationship, the prosecution's narrative took shape. They argued that Adam had both motive and opportunity. They alleged that when Maddie confronted him about deeper issues, possibly financial stress, custody concerns, or personal conflict, an altercation escalated, culminating. The defense, for its part, attempted to dismantle the motive narrative, portraying Adam as a worried father who was traumatized by the sudden loss and had perhaps chosen to grieve in a way that might appear suspicious to an outside observer. Yet as the pre-trial motions concluded and the case headed toward jury selection, public sentiment in Winona continued to lean heavily toward believing that Adam was indeed responsible. Journalists, spurred by statements from anonymous sources close to the investigation, reported that a key witness, possibly a friend or family member, had come forward with information about Adam's demeanor on the day Maddie went missing, sharing anecdotal accounts of urgent phone calls, unexplained absences, or contradictory stories. Throughout the trial proceedings, the courtroom brimmed with tension. The prosecution meticulously walked the jury through each critical piece of evidence: phone pings, digital messages, testimony from forensic technicians, and the results of advanced testing on the soil and organic matter recovered from Adam's vehicle. The attorneys also called in experts to discuss probable time of death based on the findings, providing a window that more or less aligned with the hours immediately after Maddie was last seen alive. The emotional core of the trial, however, came from the friends and family who took the stand and spoke about Maddie's devotion to her children, underscoring how improbable it was that she would abandon them voluntarily, an argument that countered the defense's subtle suggestions that she might have left of her own accord or met with an unknown third party. Meanwhile, the defense attempted to focus on the absence of a single, indisputable piece of direct evidence like eyewitness testimony or a coherent video timeline capturing Adam in the act. They contended that phone data can be misinterpreted, that suspicious behavior might not equal guilt, and that other unidentified individuals could have been responsible. Still, as witness after witness recounted the last time Maddie was seen, and expert after expert tied the forensic trail back to Adam, the gravity of his predicament loomed large. Public opinion, once a swirl of rumor, coalesced. Adam Fravel likely faced the possibility of the maximum penalty if convicted. In each cross-examination, the prosecution highlighted the stark inconsistencies in his recollection of events, contrasting them with the phone records and accounts from those who had interacted with him. A pivotal moment came when the lead detective testified about a recorded interview with Adam, in which he apparently shifted his narrative multiple times, initially claiming not to have left home that day, but later admitting he might have taken a drive to clear his head. Though the defense insisted that confusion and stress could easily lead to contradictory statements, the prosecution branded this as a calculated evasion aimed at covering up an irreparable crime. Day after day, as the jury listened, The weight of the evidence seemed to accumulate in the prosecution's favor. As the jurors filed out to deliberate, the general sentiment among courthouse observers was that the evidence had been overwhelmingly stacked in favor of the prosecution's narrative. Over the course of a few tense days, the jury pored over the exhibits, transcripts of testimony, and hours of recorded interviews. On the final day of deliberations, word spread through Winona that a verdict had been reached. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was once again packed, the atmosphere taut with finality. Adam remained visibly guarded, speaking only when prompted by the judge. The sentence handed down underscored the court's view that his crime represented a betrayal of the intimate trust that once bound him to Maddie. Ultimately, Adam Fravel was found guilty on November 7, 2024. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The quiet of the morning was suddenly shattered by a frantic call to 911. On the other end of the line was a man's voice, shaking with panic. It was Joe. His words came out jumbled, but the desperation in his tone was unmistakable. He already knew. Something terrible had happened. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do except confirm Joe's worst fear. Katie was dead. And worst of all, the circumstances surrounding her death made one thing painfully clear. This was no accident. It wasn't natural causes. At first glance, everything in the bedroom seemed tidy, but one detail stood out. A large jewelry box was left open, its drawers pulled out, and several pieces were missing. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Kathy Blair was born on May 31, 1961, in the sunny and vibrant state of California. She was raised in a warm and nurturing household, the kind where laughter filled the kitchen and family dinners were a sacred tradition. Her parents, both devoted and supportive, worked hard to provide a stable life for their children. Kathy grew up alongside her brother and sister, creating bonds and memories that would last a lifetime. Even as a child, she had a special spark, something that made her stand out. It wasn't just her infectious smile or kind heart, though she had both. It was her voice. From a young age, Kathy gravitated toward music. It wasn't something she just liked. It was something she felt. The notes and rhythms seemed to live inside her. Whether she was humming softly at home or belting out tunes at school events, music became the language through which she expressed her joy, her sorrow, and everything in between. While her siblings pursued different paths, Kathy's heart was already set. Music was not just her passion. It was her calling. By the time she was ready for college, there was no question in her mind about what direction she would take. Kathy chose to enroll at the University of Texas, a place where she could not only refine her vocal skills, but immerse herself in the rich, creative atmosphere of Austin, a city that embraced artists and dreamers. She studied vocal performance with the same determination and grace that had always defined her. And Austin quickly became more than just a temporary home. It was where her dreams began to take shape. After graduating, Kathy poured herself into a career as a music teacher and Christian choir director. Her deep love for music was matched only by her passion for teaching. She had a special gift. Not only could she sing beautifully, but she could make others believe they could too. Her students adored her, and their parents respected her. Many would say that Kathy had a way of lighting up a room just by walking into it. Her energy was contagious, and her belief in the power of music to uplift and heal made her a beloved figure in the community. Over the years, Kathy experienced the highs and lows that life often brings. She was married twice, and though both marriages ended in divorce, she remained resilient and focused. Her greatest pride and joy came from raising her two children, a son and a daughter, who she lovingly supported through every chapter of their lives. She was a devoted mother, always present, always encouraging, and always reminding them to chase their dreams with the same fearless heart she had. By 2013, Kathy was 52 and embracing a new phase of life. Her children were now grown and building lives of their own, and she found herself searching for a place where she could enjoy a bit more peace and independence. That's when she moved into a charming home in a quiet, safe suburb of Austin. The neighborhood was picturesque. Tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and a sense of calm that made it feel like the perfect retreat. For Kathy, this wasn't just a house. It was a dream fulfilled. A place to continue teaching, to direct her choir, and to finally enjoy the sanctuary she had longed for. In December 2014, just before the holidays, Kathy's son Joe, then 23 and serving in the military, came home to spend a few weeks with her before his next deployment. Their time together was precious. Joe had always been close to his mom, and the visit was a chance for both of them to reconnect, relax, and enjoy the simple joys of being home. On the evening of December 5th, Joe went out to see some friends. It was supposed to be a normal night, nothing out of the ordinary. He returned home late the next morning, the sun already high in the sky. As he walked through the front door, he called out for his mother, expecting to hear her cheerful voice. But the house was eerily quiet. A deep sense of unease crept in as he moved from room to room. When he reached her bedroom, what he discovered would forever change his life. Kathy was gone. The sight was so jarring, so unexpected, that it took a moment for the shock to wear off. But instinct kicked in. Joe immediately ran outside and dialed 911, his voice trembling with panic. Emergency responders arrived swiftly, but the scene they encountered confirmed what Joe already knew. Kathy had passed several hours earlier, and this was no natural death. The evidence made one thing heartbreakingly clear. This was a homicide. Investigators wasted no time. The bedroom became a critical piece of the puzzle. A large jewelry box sat open, its drawers pulled out and some contents missing. Pieces were scattered across the floor in what looked like a hurried attempt to take valuable items. Initially, this pointed to a robbery. But almost as quickly, doubts began to form. Detectives took note of what wasn't missing. Kathy's laptop, her cell phone, and other valuable electronics had been left untouched. There were no signs of a forced entry at the front of the house. However, the back door was unlocked. When questioned, Joe explained that his mother often left that door open, a habit born from trust in her quiet, close-knit neighborhood. It didn't make sense. Most robberies happen during the day, when homes are empty. This break-in had occurred at night, in one of the city's safest areas, and the timeline didn't add up either. Evidence on the jewelry box and nearby surfaces suggested the attacker had harmed Kathy before touching anything of value. That chilling detail led investigators to suspect a far more disturbing possibility, that the break-in had been staged to cover something up. What if the theft was just a distraction? This theory opened up a new and unsettling line of questioning. Could the person responsible have known Kathy? Was it someone who had visited the home before? Someone who knew about the unlocked door? The absence of any signs of struggle suggested the attacker may have moved quickly, with intent and knowledge of the home's layout. Despite a thorough investigation, forensic experts were unable to retrieve any fingerprints, hair samples, or usable DNA. The only physical clue left behind was a partial shoe print found near the bed, a faint imprint that, while helpful, wasn't enough to immediately identify a suspect. That one detail only deepened investigators' belief that this was no random break-in gone wrong. It felt too deliberate, too calculated, and it reinforced an increasingly disturbing theory. Faced with an unsettling crime scene and no obvious forensic trail to follow, detectives decided to pivot. If they couldn't rely on physical evidence, they would have to focus on relationships. The question they asked themselves was simple yet critical. Who would want to hurt Kathy Blair? They began to closely examine the people in her life. The ones who knew her best. The ones who had access. The ones who may have had motives that weren't immediately obvious. Naturally, they began with her immediate family, including her son Joe. After all, he had been staying in the house and had both proximity and opportunity. While the very idea was difficult to entertain, especially given the emotional trauma he was clearly experiencing, detectives had to be thorough. They questioned him carefully and reviewed his timeline. Joe told them he had spent the entire night out with friends, and officers followed up on every detail. Phone records, witness statements, and even video surveillance from a nearby gas station confirmed his alibi. Every piece of evidence aligned perfectly. With that, Joe was ruled out as a suspect. Next, investigators turned to Kathy's broader social circle. They spoke with friends, co-workers, neighbors, and members of her choir. They hoped to uncover any hidden tension, past arguments, or long-standing feuds. But time and again, they heard the same thing. Kathy was universally loved. Her students admired her. Her fellow musicians respected her. Friends described her as warm, generous, and deeply committed to her work and her faith. Just when it looked like the trail had gone cold, detectives received a piece of information that shifted the investigation in a new direction. Several of Kathy's close friends had mentioned something that stood out. Kathy had often spoken about her second ex-husband. Although they had divorced 4 years prior, the separation had been anything but peaceful. According to Kathy's friends, the relationship had turned volatile in the final stages. She had even expressed fear that he might follow her or try to contact her after the divorce. She told at least 2 friends that she didn't want him to know where she had moved. That detail was alarming and significant. Intrigued and concerned, detectives tracked the man down. He was living just outside of Austin, not too far from Kathy's new home. When police arrived to speak with him, his reaction was frankly puzzling. Upon hearing Kathy's name and being informed of her death, his immediate response was not one of confusion or sorrow. That strange an assumption immediately raised suspicions. Investigators pressed further, asking about his whereabouts on the night of December 5th. The man claimed he had gone on a short solo trip and was staying in his RV at the time. He offered up the RV for a search without hesitation, which only added to the mixed signals he was giving. Detectives combed through the vehicle but came up empty-handed. No weapons, no clothing that matched the suspect description. While his behavior was certainly strange and his statement unnerving, there simply wasn't anything concrete tying him to the scene. With no hard evidence, police had to let him go. He remained in their sights, but without any proof, they had to keep casting a wider net. Then, just a few days later, the investigation took another unexpected and eerie turn. One of Kathy's close friends reached out to police with something unsettling. She had helped organize a memorial service for Kathy, a small and heartfelt gathering of people who had known and loved her. But during the service, something odd occurred. A man, completely unfamiliar to everyone present, stood up and began to speak. From the moment he opened his mouth, people were uneasy. His speech felt off. His tone was strange, his words disjointed. It wasn't grief. It wasn't fond remembrance. It was something else. And the most bizarre part? Nobody knew who he was. These weren't casual acquaintances in the room. These were Kathy's closest friends, people who had known her for years. Yet not a single one of them recognized this man. His stories about Kathy didn't align with reality. He spoke in vague generalities, as though he was improvising or pulling information from public sources rather than from personal memory. The strange incident nagged at investigators. Curious, they followed up and eventually identified the man as a sales clerk who worked at a women's clothing store in the area. When questioned, the man readily admitted he had never met Kathy. He told police he had read about the murder in the news and felt compelled to attend the service because he was moved by the story. He claimed his intention had been to honor her. His explanation, though unsettling, didn't break any laws. And again, there was no direct link to Kathy, no motive, and no evidence of involvement. He was released. Once again, the case returned to a standstill. But just as the momentum seemed lost, an unexpected call came in. A man named Rob reached out to the police saying he had something they might want to see, something unusual. Rob was an outdoor enthusiast who had recently purchased a high-tech thermal imaging scope. This scope had the ability to record video footage, even in low-light conditions. Eager to test it out, Rob had gone for an early morning walk on December 6th in a wooded area near his home. As he wandered through the trees, he watched the surroundings through the scope, just getting used to its features. That's when something strange caught his attention. He noticed a car driving slowly down a nearby road. It didn't speed by like most morning commuters. Instead, it crept along before finally pulling over to the side. A few moments later, a man stepped out and walked away from the vehicle, disappearing into a quiet side street that, according to Rob, led in the general direction of Kathy Blair's neighborhood. At the time, Rob thought little of it. Maybe the man was just taking a walk. Maybe he lived nearby. But after hearing the news about Kathy's death later that day, he remembered the odd encounter. That's when he remembered his thermal camera had been recording the entire time. He went back and reviewed the footage, and there it was, clear as day in the thermal recording. The figure of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, stepping out of a vehicle and walking down a quiet street under the cover of night. The man's outline was sharp, his posture firm, and there was something distinct about his stride, a purposeful gait, almost like he knew exactly where he was headed. It wasn't random. It didn't look like someone out for a stroll. It looked like intent. Rob immediately contacted the police and handed over the footage. Investigators were intrigued. Finally, something that could move the investigation forward. But there was a catch. Because the footage had been recorded using a thermal imaging device, it only captured the man's silhouette. There were no facial features, no hair or clothing details, no license plate on the vehicle. Identifying the individual from the video would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. Still, all hope was not lost. Detectives focused on what they could gather. The man's general height, his build, and most importantly, his walk, something often unique to an individual. And then there was the vehicle. Although the thermal scope hadn't captured a license plate, the shape, size, and heat signature of the car were distinct enough to allow investigators to narrow it down to a few possible models. This opened up a small but potentially crucial window of opportunity. The team compared the thermal silhouette to their two leading persons of interest, Kathy's second ex-husband and the strange man who had shown up at her memorial. But the comparisons didn't line up. The ex-husband was shorter and stockier, and his car didn't match the vehicle seen in the footage. As for the memorial attendee, his physical characteristics didn't fit either, and he didn't drive a car resembling the one caught on camera. It was frustrating. The footage provided a glimpse into what may have been the killer's escape, or possibly arrival, but didn't give them a name. Detectives had no choice but to dig deeper. They reviewed the video frame by frame, again and again, hoping to extract even the smallest additional detail. But despite their best efforts, they found nothing new. For the time being, the case returned to a painful standstill. Then, December 15, 10 days after Kathy's tragic death. That morning, a caretaker arrived to check on an elderly couple, Billy and Sydney Shelton. She visited them regularly to help with light cleaning, errands, and companionship. But as she approached the front of the house, she noticed something was wrong. The front door was ajar, and there were visible signs of damage around the lock, like someone had forced their way in. With growing dread, she stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet. Moving cautiously down the hallway, she eventually reached the bedroom, and what she saw inside shook her to the core. She immediately backed out of the house and called the police, her voice trembling with panic. When officers arrived, they were struck by a chilling sense of déjà vu. The bedroom bore a disturbing resemblance to the scene they had encountered at Kathy Blair's home. Just like before, the jewelry box had been emptied. Drawers were pulled out and scattered across the floor, their contents missing. And once again, the rest of the home appeared untouched. Electronics, cash, personal valuables, all left behind. The similarities were far too precise to ignore. Both incidents had occurred at night while the victims were likely asleep. Both homes had been targeted for jewelry, and both were located just 15 minutes apart in quiet Austin suburbs. It was no longer a question of coincidence. The evidence suggested something far more disturbing, a potential pattern. Initially, investigators had leaned toward the theory that Kathy's murder had been personal, committed by someone she knew, someone with a grudge. But the Shelton case forced them to reevaluate. Billy and Sydney were a gentle, elderly couple with no known enemies. There was no apparent motive. There were no links between them and Kathy, no shared social circles, no common acquaintances, no places they had both frequented. Their lives had never intersected. That could only mean one thing. He was selecting homes, situations, vulnerable people. Detectives were now looking at the horrifying possibility that this was the work of a serial offender, someone who moved through neighborhoods undetected. This wasn't just about solving a murder anymore. It was a race to prevent the next one. Police redoubled their efforts. They returned to the victims' neighborhoods, going door to door, re-interviewing everyone who had known Kathy, Billy, or Sydney. They urged the public to come forward with any tip, no matter how small, no matter how seemingly insignificant. And finally, that persistence paid off. One of Kathy's longtime friends reached out. She remembered a conversation she had with Kathy just a few months before the murder, something that hadn't seemed especially important at the time, but now stood out like a flashing light. Kathy had mentioned that a handyman had come by her house, sent by her landlord to fix a few things. The man had done a poor job, but that wasn't what had bothered her. She had described his behavior as odd, unsettling even. She hadn't been able to put her finger on it, but something about him had made her uncomfortable. Following this new lead, detectives contacted Kathy's landlord and asked for the name of the contractor. After a bit of digging, they found it: Timothy Parlin. Timothy was a local resident with a record that raised immediate concern. His background check revealed a long list of prior arrests, but there was a consistent pattern. He targeted homes, specifically homes with accessible jewelry. Theft, burglary, breaking, and entering. Jewelry was always the common thread. At the time, Timothy had been out on parole, living in a long-stay hotel not far from either crime scene. When officers arrived and asked to speak with him, Timothy didn't resist. He agreed to answer a few questions, but notably refused to let them into his room. Instead, he insisted on stepping outside to talk in the hotel parking lot, a small decision, but one that raised a subtle red flag. Why didn't he want them to see his living space? What was he hiding? At first, the conversation was casual. When asked about Kathy, Timothy initially claimed he didn't remember her at all. But as detectives provided more details, her neighborhood, the timing of the work, the nature of the job, his memory suddenly returned. He admitted to doing some repairs at her home, but was quick to emphasize that he hadn't had any further contact and certainly had nothing to do with her tragic death. In fact, he claimed he had an alibi. On the night, he said, he had been working a night shift at a local convenience store. A straightforward story. Too straightforward, perhaps. But even as he spoke, detectives noted an important physical discrepancy. Timothy didn't match the profile captured in the thermal imaging footage recorded by Rob just hours after Kathy's murder. The silhouette in the video appeared taller, broader, and moved with a very different gait. Moreover, Timothy's personal vehicle didn't match the heat signature or general shape of the car seen in the thermal video. The differences were significant. These details didn't exonerate him, but they certainly complicated things. With no solid physical evidence tying Timothy to the crime at that moment, detectives had no choice but to let him go, at least temporarily. They left the hotel empty-handed, but with a nagging feeling that the story wasn't over. Then, as often happens in complex investigations, the truth began to unravel not because of what the suspect said, but because of what he lied about. As part of their routine verification, detectives followed up on Timothy's alibi. When they called the convenience store where he claimed to be working the night of the murder, they learned that Timothy hadn't been employed there in over a week. In fact, he had been fired days before Kathy's death. His carefully crafted story had just fallen apart. Alarmed by the discovery, detectives rushed back to the hotel to confront him, but when they arrived, it was too late. Timothy was gone. Instead, his wife answered the door. She seemed nervous but cooperative. She allowed the officers to search the room, and it was during that search that detectives found something that would finally shift the investigation toward resolution: a pawn shop receipt. The date on the receipt matched the date of Kathy's murder. More specifically, the timestamp indicated that the items had been sold just hours after she was killed. The listed items? Several pieces of jewelry. Detectives took the receipt and immediately headed to the pawn shop to investigate further. Once there, the pieces started falling into place. The pawn shop owner allowed detectives to examine the items sold by Timothy. And one by one, they were able to confirm that the jewelry belonged to Kathy Blair. Her children were brought in to identify some of the pieces, and they immediately recognized items their mother had cherished. But that wasn't all. Security cameras at the pawn shop had also captured footage of the transaction, along with the vehicle Timothy had arrived in. It wasn't the car registered to his name. This one belonged to his sister. And, critically, the car bore a strong resemblance to the one seen on Rob's thermal footage. Similar body style, similar size. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was close. That was enough to secure a search warrant for the vehicle. Forensic experts conducted a meticulous sweep of the car, and the results were damning. On the passenger seat and the floorboard, investigators discovered trace evidence, microscopic material that was later tested and confirmed to be Kathy's DNA. The scientific analysis left no room for doubt. This car had been used in connection with the crime. With this critical evidence in hand, police arrested Timothy Parlin and brought him in for a formal interrogation. But what happened next only deepened the mystery. Timothy, even when confronted with the jewelry, the pawnshop footage, and the forensic evidence from the vehicle, refused to confess. He remained eerily calm and repeated a phrase over and over again. "These hands have never killed anyone." The line became a mantra, one that struck detectives as both calculated and strangely rehearsed. It was as if Timothy believed that denying involvement, no matter how overwhelming the evidence, would somehow make it untrue. But then, after hours of questioning, a shift occurred. Not a confession, but a deflection. Timothy claimed he hadn't committed the crime himself. Instead, he said he knew who had. According to him, the person responsible was a man named Sean Benel Kassar. Detectives were immediately skeptical. The timing of the accusation, the vagueness of the details, and the strength of the case already built against Timothy made the story seem like a desperate attempt to redirect blame. Still, due diligence required that they follow the lead. They ran a background check on Sean and were surprised by what they found. At 30 years old, Sean was a former science teacher with a degree in microbiology. He had no criminal record and, most oddly of all, he lived several hundred miles away from Austin. On the surface, he seemed like the unlikeliest of suspects. But detectives wanted to be absolutely certain. They traveled to his town to speak with him directly, and the moment they sat down, the case took another unexpected turn. Sean acknowledged knowing Timothy. He said they had met a few months prior and described Timothy as strange, someone who made him uncomfortable. According to Sean, they hadn't maintained regular contact. But then, almost offhandedly, he dropped a detail that caught detectives completely off guard. He had been in Austin on the night. Not only that, he had stayed at Timothy's place during that time. The coincidence was alarming. At first, Sean claimed that Timothy had left the house late that night without saying anything. But moments later, his story shifted. Now he admitted they had gone to Kathy's neighborhood together. According to him, Timothy had exited the vehicle alone and returned just minutes later with a bag. When Sean looked inside, he saw it was filled with jewelry. Sean insisted he had no knowledge of Timothy's intentions, had never planned to be involved, and was horrified by what had happened. As the interview continued and detectives carefully navigated their questions, Sean remained relatively calm, offering answers that were measured, though increasingly inconsistent. Then, in a moment that would shift the course of the interrogation, Sean asked if he could use the restroom. That's when something unexpected happened. As Sean walked down the hallway, the investigator who had reviewed Rob's thermal footage from the night of Kathy's murder felt an unsettling jolt of recognition. Sean's gait, the rhythm of his steps, the sway of his shoulders, even the way he carried his weight, was nearly identical to the figure seen walking away from the vehicle on the thermal video. Up until that point, Sean had appeared to be a reluctant witness, someone pulled into a situation he hadn't fully understood. But now, that perception shifted. When Sean returned from the restroom, the tone of the questioning shifted. Detectives challenged him more directly, poking holes in his previous statements. They laid out a new theory, that perhaps Timothy had forced him into the house against his will. It was a calculated psychological move. Their goal was to dislodge his story without accusing him outright. The pressure worked. Sean hesitated. His eyes dropped. He fidgeted with his hands. Then, in a subdued voice, he admitted something new. He had entered Kathy's house alone. According to his revised account, The plan had always been a simple burglary. He claimed Timothy stayed behind in the car while he slipped in through the unlocked back door. He wandered quietly through the home, searching for anything of value. That's when he noticed the jewelry box on the dresser. At first, Sean insisted that he never meant to hurt anyone. In his version of events, he left without waking Kathy, returned to the car, and said nothing. He even speculated that Timothy might have re-entered the home after he left. But detectives were far from convinced. They already knew that evidence had been found on and near the jewelry box. This meant the box had only been disturbed after not before. Sean's story simply didn't line up with the timeline or forensic findings. Eventually, the weight of the truth became too heavy to carry. In a low voice, barely audible at first, Sean admitted that it was him. It was a chilling admission, and one that finally gave detectives what they needed to move forward. Though the confession was significant, investigators still had concerns. The story seemed incomplete, and parts of it felt crafted to minimize Sean's responsibility. Still, it was enough for an arrest. To bolster their case further, detectives took Sean's shoes and sent them for forensic analysis. The goal: compare them to the partial footprint left behind in Kathy's bedroom. The results came back quickly, and they were decisive. The pattern on the sole of Sean's shoe matched the print found at the scene. The dimensions were exact, the wear patterns aligned. But the case wasn't over. Detectives still had one major concern: the second crime, the home invasion of Billy and Sydney Shelton. When they asked Sean if he was involved in that case, his entire demeanor changed. His posture stiffened. His responses turned flat. And then he invoked his right to legal counsel, refusing to answer any more questions. It was a clear shift, and a frustrating one for investigators. With no confession and no physical evidence tying Sean directly to the Shelton crime scene, police were stuck. They had their suspicions, but suspicions weren't enough to close a case. So they turned their attention back to Timothy Parlin. Based on that, detectives arrested Timothy as an accomplice. When questioned again, Timothy admitted to driving Sean to Kathy's house. He maintained that he stayed in the car the entire time and claimed to have no idea what Sean intended to do inside. He said he only learned something was wrong when Sean returned on the bag. Still, Timothy confessed to pawning Kathy's jewelry shortly afterward, an act that legally and morally tied him to the crime. When asked about the Sheltons, Timothy's reaction was different. He didn't ask for a lawyer. Instead, he admitted that he and Sean had driven to the house with the intent of stealing valuables. Once again, he claimed he had stayed in the car while Sean went inside. That same pattern. That same story. In the end, Timothy was formally charged in connection with all three murders. As for Sean, he was officially charged with Kathy Blair's murder. While detectives strongly suspected his involvement in the second crime, they lacked the concrete evidence needed to secure a second indictment at that time. The court decided that the two men would be tried separately. During his trial, Timothy maintained his innocence, but the prosecution argued that he had every opportunity to intervene, and chose not to. His silence, his involvement in pawning the stolen items, and his continued partnership with Sean painted a damning picture. After several days of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Timothy Parlin was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But if Timothy's trial was relatively straightforward, Sean Kasser's legal battle was anything but. His confession was central to the prosecution's argument. After intense deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous decision. Sean Kasser was found guilty of the murder of Kathy Blair. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, just like his accomplice. Thursday, April 4th, 2019. A tip had come in. It led to a self-storage facility, the kind people usually rent to stash away old furniture, holiday decorations, or forgotten boxes of clothes. Police responded swiftly. They cut the lock, rolled open the metal gate, and stepped inside. At first glance, the unit looked typical, crammed with cardboard boxes and everyday clutter. But something felt off. Even with the heavy scent of air fresheners hanging in the air, there was an eerie stillness. In a back corner, partially hidden behind a stack of items, officers found evidence. They called the medical examiner right away. It didn't take long. Dental records confirmed what detectives had feared. Janine Camerata had been found. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Janine Camerata was born in 1981. She lived in Staten Island, New York. To her family, she was more than just a sister or daughter. She was the one they turned to, leaned on, and laughed with. Her sister, Christine Ross, often described Janine as the glue that held the family together. If you needed someone to talk to or a helping hand, Janine would be there, no questions asked. Her journey into teaching began as a calling, not just a job. By 2005, Janine had found her path. She was hired by the New York City Department of Education and eventually made her way to Public School 29 in the Staten Island neighborhood of Castleton Corners. There, she poured her energy and creativity into teaching first grade. For Janine, teaching was not simply a way to earn a paycheck. It was a passion. She would spend late nights preparing activities to make learning fun and engaging, designing classroom decorations, and planning lessons that brought joy to her young students. Her dedication was noticed not only by her co-workers but by the children themselves, who showered her with hugs, drawings, and smiles that lit up her world. However, being a public school teacher in New York City didn't come with financial ease. To support her household, Janine picked up a second job working at a store in Grant City. It meant longer days and fewer breaks, but she never complained. She kept going, fueled by something deeper than ambition. Her true motivation came from home, her children. Janine was a proud and devoted mother to 3 kids. Her oldest, a teenager from a previous relationship, lived with their father in Long Island. Her younger children, a son just 3 years old and a daughter aged 7, were from her marriage to Michael Camerata. That relationship at first had seemed full of promise. Michael had been affectionate, attentive, and generous with his affection in the beginning. Janine, who dreamed of a stable, loving family, believed she had found her partner. They married in April, during what Janine hoped would be the beginning of a beautiful chapter. Like many couples, they experienced a honeymoon phase filled with optimism. But as time passed, things began to change. Tensions replaced tenderness. Disagreements became more frequent. What once seemed like a promising partnership began to unravel. By 2017, Janine had made a difficult decision. She packed up her life and moved out of their shared home. She found a new place in New Brighton, determined to create a safe and peaceful environment for herself and her children. That move wasn't just about physical space. It was symbolic of her decision to reclaim her peace and independence. Janine also sought a legal order of protection against Michael, a significant step that reflected how difficult the situation had become. She was now navigating not only life as a single mom, but also a complicated legal battle. Janine wanted full custody of her younger children, who at that time remained with their father in Queens. Every extra dollar she earned was set aside for legal fees, housing, and anything that might bring her family back together under one roof. Despite all of this, Janine showed extraordinary resilience. She balanced 2 demanding jobs, prepared for court dates, and remained fiercely focused on the well-being of her kids. Her dream was clear: a stable home, a fresh start, and a reunited family. And she was willing to work tirelessly to make that dream come true. On the evening of Saturday, March 30th, 2019, Janine went about her usual routine. It was just after 8 p.m. when she wrapped up a shopping trip with her boyfriend, Aaron Suchi. The two had been at Target, picking up household essentials. Nothing out of the ordinary. Afterward, Janine dropped Aaron off at his apartment in New Brighton. She told him she was heading to Queens to visit her 2 youngest children. It was a simple statement, something she'd done before. Her white 2017 Chevrolet Cruze drove off into the early evening, headlights fading into the dimming sky. That was the last time anyone would see Janine Camerata in person. As Sunday came and went with no word from Janine, concern began to grow. She didn't text, she didn't call. On Monday, April 1st, she failed to show up for work at Public School 29. Her principal, Linda Manfredi, noticed immediately. Janine was known for being punctual, dependable. someone who would always give notice if she were running late or unable to come in. Her silence set off alarms. At the same time, Aaron grew anxious. He hadn't heard from Janine since Saturday night. Calls went unanswered. Texts were met with silence. By the afternoon of April 1, a missing person report was filed with the NYPD. Detectives began working the case immediately. Their first questions were straightforward. Where was her car? Did she make it to Queens that night? Who saw her last? Who did she speak with? As police began retracing Janine's last known movements, her sister Christine stepped forward to provide crucial information. Just 2 days before Janine disappeared, on Thursday, she had filed official divorce papers against Michael Camerata and submitted a legal request for full custody of their children. Christine voiced a thought that others were beginning to share. Could something have happened between Janine and Michael? Christine explained that the relationship between Janine and her estranged husband had long been tense. Their custody disagreements had grown more intense, and Janine had often confided in her sister about the stress she felt navigating that conflict. While Michael was an obvious figure of interest in the case, Christine also expressed discomfort about Aaron, Janine's current boyfriend. Janine had never shared much about Aaron with her family. When Christine met him for the first time, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about him seemed off. Although he was polite on the surface, there was an unease that lingered. Detectives noted Christine's comments and began a deeper look into Aaron's past. A background check revealed concerning information. Years before meeting Janine, Aaron had been arrested more than once. One of the charges was for contempt, related to a violation of a protection order filed by a previous partner. While this didn't confirm anything specific, it added a new layer of complexity to the case. Law enforcement now had 2 individuals in Janine's life who required further investigation: a former husband with a custody battle brewing and a current partner with a questionable past. Detectives were now moving with increasing urgency. Janine Camerata had been missing for days, and the window for finding answers was narrowing by the hour. One of the first people they needed to speak to was Aaron Suchi, the man who, by all accounts, was the last person to see Janine alive. They didn't show up at his door with handcuffs or accusations. Instead, they made a polite but firm request. Would he be willing to come in and talk? Aaron agreed. He wasn't evasive. In fact, he seemed open, even eager to clear the air. During their interview, he portrayed his relationship with Janine as warm, affectionate, and entirely uncomplicated. He said they'd met at work and had clicked quickly. According to Aaron, he cared deeply about Janine and believed they had something special, even if they weren't living together. He recounted the evening of Saturday, March 30th, when Janine had come by his place. They'd gone shopping together, just picking up a few things at Target, nothing unusual. Afterward, she dropped him off at his apartment in New Brighton around 9 p.m. She told him she was heading out to Queens to see her 2 youngest children. Aaron said he watched her drive away in her white 2017 Chevrolet Cruze, unaware that it would be the last time he'd see her. Over the next 2 days, Aaron tried reaching her. He sent texts, left voicemails, but there was no response, no returned call, no explanation. Then, on Monday, April 1st, he claimed he received a series of strange and unexpected text messages from Janine's number. According to Aaron, the messages said she'd had a rough few days, that she didn't want to talk to anyone, and that she needed space. She even asked him not to contact her, saying she would reach out when she was ready. Aaron interpreted this as the end of their relationship, delivered without warning or closure. Still hurt and confused, he responded with several messages of his own, frustrated, emotional, maybe even bordering on obsessive. Those texts would later raise eyebrows. Detectives reviewed the messages carefully. They could have been seen as questionable under different circumstances. But because Aaron was transparent about their content and offered his phone willingly, investigators didn't immediately consider him a suspect. At least not yet. They made note of his cooperation and let him leave, but they made it clear. If they had further questions, he'd be hearing from them again. The deeper the investigation went, the more complex Janine's personal life appeared to be. Her recent divorce filing loomed large in detectives' minds. She had submitted legal paperwork against her estranged husband, Michael Camerata, just days before she went missing. That timing was impossible to ignore. At the same time, Erin's behavior, though not criminal on its own, was a puzzle piece that didn't sit quite right. Between her new boyfriend's past brushes with the law and her ex-husband's turbulent history with her, detectives were left with a delicate web of relationships to untangle. Somewhere in that tangled mess, the truth had to be hiding. While detectives worked their leads, Janine's inner circle sprang into action. Her friend Dominique took to the media, reaching out to television networks, online news platforms, local papers, anyone who would listen. They needed eyes on the story. Another close friend, Jessica, was particularly vocal, expressing growing concern and desperation. She'd known Janine for years and felt certain that this wasn't a case of someone stepping away voluntarily. Her gut told her something wasn't right. Thanks to their efforts, Janine's story began to gain traction. News outlets started running stories. Posts circulated across social media, asking anyone with information to call the Crime Stoppers tip line. It had now been 3 days since Janine was last seen, and public interest in her case was building. Detectives knew that every passing hour without contact increased the likelihood that something serious had happened. The disappearance was beginning to look less like a personal matter and more like a criminal case. Their first stop was Janine's apartment. With her landlord's cooperation, they entered her home, hoping to find a clue, any sign of what had happened or where she might have gone. But nothing stood out. The apartment was undisturbed. All of her personal belongings remained. Clothing was still in drawers. Nothing had been hastily packed or moved. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no clues pointing to a hurried exit. If Janine had planned to go somewhere, she hadn't packed for it. It didn't look like she had planned anything at all. One potential lead came in the form of her vehicles. Janine had 2 cars registered under her name: the white Chevrolet Cruze she was last seen driving, and a Chrysler Town and Country minivan, which she had allowed Michael to use for the children. From interviews, detectives confirmed she mostly drove the Cruze herself. So where was it? In a city as vast and crowded as New York, investigators often rely on a unique technological tool: license plate readers. These high-speed cameras are mounted on poles, overpasses, and police vehicles, and they scan plates all day, every day, feeding information into a citywide database. When detectives searched Janine's plate, they found a helpful, if confusing, pattern. The town and country had multiple pings across Sunday and Monday, mostly centered around Michael's usual routes. That made sense. He was still using the vehicle. But the Cruze was different. There was one hit from Saturday night, shortly after 9 p.m., matching the time Erin said Janine had left for Queens. Then nothing. Until a single ping on Sunday night, showing the Cruze crossing back into Staten Island via the Verrazzano Bridge. It was nearly 24 hours later. And after that, nothing. The trail stopped cold. This detail raised new questions. If Janine had gone to Queens on Saturday, why did her vehicle return to Staten Island the next evening? Who was driving it? And where did it go after that last sighting? Detectives knew they had to speak with Michael, but that presented a complication. Unlike most people in 2019, Michael Camerata didn't have a cell phone. That detail seemed odd, unusual enough to make detectives take notice. How could someone raising children, involved in a custody battle, and working full-time in a city like New York not have a phone? Instead, they reached out to his sister, who shared that Michael was working as a mail carrier in Manhattan. If detectives wanted to speak with him directly, they'd have to go to his job. A new worry also began to take shape, one that had less to do with clues and more to do with responsibility. Janine had been missing for 3 full days. As detectives continued to chase leads in Janine Camerata's disappearance, the next logical step was to get clarity on the people closest to her children, those who were caring for them in her absence. That led them straight to Aisha Egea, the current girlfriend of Michael Camerata. It was Michael's sister who first explained Aisha's role in the children's lives. According to her, Aisha often handled school drop-offs and pickups, especially when Michael was working his postal route in Manhattan. It had been Aisha, not Michael, who drove the kids to school on that Tuesday morning. When the investigators reached out to Aisha, they gave her clear instructions: turn the children over to county social workers for the time being. This wasn't a punishment. It was a precaution. After the children were safely in the hands of Child Protective Services, Detective Torres sat down with Aisha for a formal interview. Right from the start, something didn't feel quite right. When Aisha was informed that the NYPD was investigating Janine's disappearance, her reaction was flat. Not cold exactly, but oddly disconnected. Torres noted her detached demeanor. After all, Aisha was temporarily caring for Janine's children. Shouldn't there have been at least some concern for their missing mother? As the conversation progressed, Aisha painted a very different version of events, one filled with friendly exchanges and casual interactions. She said that over time, she and Janine had developed a cordial relationship. Janine, she claimed, had even encouraged her connection with Michael, once saying they'd probably make a good couple. That detail surprised the detective, but wasn't unbelievable on its own. Aisha explained that Janine had once been her children's teacher, and their friendship had evolved from school interactions. Janine occasionally asked Aisha to babysit, and there had been no visible tension between them, at least according to Aisha. When Detective Torres pressed further about the days leading up to Janine's disappearance, Aisha provided a new timeline. She said that on the day before Janine went missing, Janine had reached out and arranged to meet Michael in Queens. The purpose? To discuss custody and the newly served court documents concerning alimony and child support. According to Aisha, the meeting happened in front of their building. Janine got into the vehicle with them. They allegedly drove just 1 block away. Janine asked to take the children home with her, but Michael declined, claiming the kids were already asleep. Instead of pushing back, Janine apparently said she'd just rest for a while in the car. Aisha claimed that she and Michael left Janine there, sleeping peacefully, and went back inside the apartment. That, Aisha said, was the last time she saw her. But that account didn't sit well with Torres. Leaving a woman who had just driven in from Staten Island, alone in a car in the middle of the night without checking on her afterward, that didn't sound like the behavior of people who were concerned for her well-being. And yet, at this point in the investigation, there was still no physical evidence to suggest a crime had taken place. It remained a missing persons case, though the shadows were growing longer. While Torres was speaking with Aisha, social workers were interviewing Janine's children. They didn't know where she was, and they didn't understand why no one could tell them when she was coming back. After the interviews, and in the absence of any legal reason to hold them elsewhere, the children were returned temporarily to Aisha's care. At that moment, Aisha and Michael became the last confirmed adults to have seen Janine Camerata. Later that day, detectives made their way into Manhattan to speak directly with Michael. He was on his postal route when they arrived. From the first minute of the interview, Michael's demeanor set off subtle alarms. He wasn't panicked or defensive, but he wasn't overly concerned either. There was a detachment in his tone, a kind of emotional distance that didn't sit right with experienced investigators. When asked to recount his version of events, Michael gave a story that echoed Aisha's but with notable differences. He admitted to meeting up with Janine on Saturday night and said that Aisha had been with him. He acknowledged there had been an argument, mostly centered around the divorce and custody filings. According to him, the conversation ended with Janine deciding to leave. He said she got back into her Chevrolet Cruze and drove off toward Staten Island. That was, he claimed, the last he saw of her. But there was a problem, one that technology had already uncovered. The NYPD's license plate readers had captured Janine's Cruze leaving Staten Island on Saturday night, which matched the timeline Michael gave. But then they picked up another hit on Sunday night, showing the vehicle returning back to Staten Island. This contradicted Michael's claim that he hadn't seen Janine after their Saturday meeting. When pressed on this, detectives asked the question directly. "Are you absolutely certain this is what happened?" Michael started fidgeting. His earlier composure faltered. He shifted in his seat, his hands restless. The room seemed to close in around him. Then, under mounting pressure, he admitted something that changed everything. He confessed that tensions had escalated that Saturday night. The conversation had turned into an argument, which had something to do with the custody battle, the alimony demands, and the newly served court papers. Michael didn't offer a full account of what happened next, but he admitted that he was guilty. That confession alone dismantled both his and Aisha's earlier stories. It meant they had both lied. But just as quickly as he opened the door to the truth, Michael shut it again. He stopped cooperating and asked for a lawyer, bringing the interview to an abrupt halt. Still, that brief window of honesty was enough. Based on his statements and inconsistencies, police placed Michael under arrest, not for Janine's disappearance just yet, but on misdemeanor assault charges stemming from prior incidents. It gave authorities time. It allowed them to hold him while they continued gathering evidence. As detectives combed through Michael's history with Janine, more troubling pieces fell into place. Jessica, one of Janine's closest friends, remembered a time she pulled Janine aside and asked, "Are you okay? Is something going on?" But Janine always brushed off those concerns with a smile and a soft, "Everything's fine." Looking back, Jessica believes those were protective lies, Janine trying to keep her troubles private. But what truly haunted Jessica was what happened after Janine's disappearance. Jessica had continued texting Janine in the days that followed, but something about the replies didn't sit right. The tone felt off. The messages were too abrupt, too unlike Janine's usual voice. She was convinced, deep down, that the person she was texting wasn't Janine at all. She believed it was someone pretending to be her, and she had a very strong suspicion about who it was. Michael Camerata. By this point in the investigation, Michael Camerata was no longer just someone of interest. He was now the primary suspect in what detectives feared was not just a disappearance, but something far more tragic. Investigators had already started gathering evidence from multiple angles, but the most telling and undeniable breakthrough came in the form of surveillance footage. It was the kind of evidence that didn't leave much room for interpretation. Detectives had obtained crystal-clear footage from the apartment complex's security system. These weren't blurry, distant clips. This was high-resolution, time-stamped video that captured the evening of March 30th with striking clarity. It showed everything. At first, the video showed Janine's white Chevrolet Cruze pulling up outside Michael's residence. She was behind the wheel. Moments later, both Michael and his girlfriend Aisha Egea approached and climbed into the car. From there, the Cruze drove a short distance down the street and then parked. Roughly 20 minutes passed, an odd amount of time to remain stationary on a city block without explanation. Then something strange happened. Michael exited the vehicle, walked around to the driver's side, got in, and drove the car back toward the building. That single action completely dismantled Aisha's earlier statement, in which she claimed that Janine had stayed behind in the car to rest. If Janine had still been inside, why didn't she drive the vehicle herself? Why had Michael taken the wheel? What followed next sent a chill through everyone watching in the surveillance room. Later that night, the camera showed Michael emerging into the courtyard again. Only now he wasn't alone, and he wasn't empty-handed. He pushed a shopping cart, the kind you'd usually see at a grocery store. From the footage, it was obvious the bag wasn't light. The detectives' expressions darkened as they watched. Then came Aisha, holding the door open for him as he wheeled the cart into the building. It wasn't over. The next morning, in footage from the same building, Michael and Aisha were seen again. They moved quickly, almost too calmly. Two people acting as if nothing were unusual. But everything about it was unusual. It was clear to the investigators that something had been concealed. Aisha was brought back in for another round of questioning. Her demeanor remained eerily calm, almost emotionless, which stood in stark contrast to the mountain of evidence piling up. She stuck to the same story she had told the day before, as though repetition alone could make it true. That strategy didn't last long. Detectives showed her a series of still images, frames taken from the security footage. There she was, helping Michael. There she was, holding the door. There she was, assisting in a series of events that no longer resembled innocent errands. There were 3 people in that car, one of the detectives said firmly, referring to the original footage. But when it pulled back up, only 2 people got out, you and Michael. So where is Janine? Cornered and out of excuses, Aisha's carefully constructed narrative began to fall apart. Her voice shook slightly. Her gaze dropped. And then, finally, she spoke, offering a new version of the night's events, one that carried far more weight and far more implications. Janine and Michael argued, and according to Aisha, things got out of control. At one point, Michael slid into the driver's side himself and drove the vehicle away from the area where they'd parked. Later, Michael returned on foot, Aisha said, carrying shopping bags and retrieving the cart. She admitted helping him. She claimed that after falling asleep for a short time, she awoke to find Janine gone. Michael had already left again, alone. Where he went, what happened in those missing hours, she claimed not to know. Detectives had heard enough. Aisha was placed under arrest and charged as an accessory. She had participated in events connected to Janine's disappearance and had knowingly misled investigators. Her arrest marked a turning point in the case, a dramatic escalation that confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. This was no longer a missing persons case. This was now a homicide investigation. It was Thursday, April 4th, 2019. 5 days since Janine's white Chevrolet Cruze had disappeared into the night. A tip had come in. Michael had recently been seen at a storage facility located on a quiet stretch of Staten Island, just 4.5 miles from Janine's New Brighton apartment. It was the kind of facility most people used to store old furniture, seasonal decorations, or boxes of old clothes, not secrets. The storage was registered under Michael's name. That alone was enough to secure a search warrant. The police team arrived quickly. The lock was cut. The metal gate rolled up. Inside was a standard unit, cluttered with boxes and everyday items. But it wasn't the contents that caught their attention. Even though the air was laced with air fresheners, the atmosphere was unnatural. In one corner, partially obscured by stacked items, officers discovered evidence. The NYPD immediately contacted the medical examiner. It didn't take long. Dental records confirmed what investigators had already suspected. Janine Camerata had been found. The next step was clear. Investigators needed to build a case strong enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Michael Camerata was responsible. The storage unit, registered in his name, was a critical piece of evidence, but they needed to lock in timelines and connect the dots with absolute certainty. Surveillance footage from the storage facility provided another vital clue. It showed Michael arriving in the Chrysler Town and Country, the same vehicle he often used to transport. That footage confirmed a devastating truth. Michael had been at the storage unit. The timeline of events and Aisha's confession all pointed toward a carefully coordinated effort. But there was more. The autopsy revealed findings that contradicted Aisha's version of events. Though she claimed Michael had been in the driver's seat and Janine in the front passengers, the evidence suggested Janine had been seated in the back. That detail raised a deeply unsettling question. Was Aisha more involved than she claimed? The deeper investigators delved into the case, the more evidence they uncovered, and the more undeniable the conclusion became. Aisha Egea had not just stood by. She had actively participated in nearly every stage of the crime. Surveillance footage, witness accounts, her own shifting testimony, each piece painted a chilling picture of complicity. As the investigation developed, and as both physical and digital evidence piled up, authorities upgraded the charges to second-degree murder for both Michael Camerata and Aisha Egea. The charges were grave. Prosecutors alleged that Janine Camerata had been deliberately and maliciously targeted, and that both Michael and Aisha had taken part, just days after she served Michael with divorce and custody paperwork. Despite the evidence against them, both Michael and Aisha entered pleas of not guilty. The prosecution argued that the motive behind the crime came down to something disturbingly ordinary: money. Janine had recently taken the legal steps to not only finalize her divorce, but also seek full custody of her children and enforce alimony and child support obligations. If successful, that legal move would have meant serious financial strain for Michael. Prosecutors alleged that this wasn't something Michael could accept, and that Aisha, who depended on his support, had just as much reason to be concerned. Michael's defense team, led by attorney Mario Gucci, didn't try to completely deny his involvement. Instead, they crafted an alternative narrative, one that shifted the blame almost entirely onto Aisha. The defense's central claim was that Aisha had the most to lose. She was the feared that a court victory for Janine would not only disrupt her home, but end her relationship with Michael, whom she saw as her emotional and financial partner. According to the defense, Aisha acted out of desperation, and Michael, while flawed, was not the mastermind. The case moved slowly through the legal system, delayed by procedural filings, pretrial motions. But on September 28, 2021, more than 2 years after Janine's disappearance, justice finally began its formal march forward. In the state Supreme Court in St. George, Staten Island, Michael Camerata's trial officially began. It wasn't a short affair. Over the course of 5 grueling weeks, the courtroom became the battleground where prosecutors and defense attorneys laid out 2 entirely different versions of the same chilling story. The jury heard from law enforcement officers, forensic experts, and close friends of Janine. They reviewed GPS data from the van, showing its movements from Queens to Staten Island. The prosecution's position was clear and unwavering. This was not a tragic accident. Michael had a motive, a plan, and the means. The defense, though, pushed hard on its counter-theory. Attorney Mario Gucci emphasized inconsistencies in Aisha's testimony and highlighted her decision to take a plea deal later in the process. He suggested that Aisha had acted alone or taken the lead, portraying Michael as a man caught in circumstances spiraling beyond. His client, he said, had made terrible mistakes but was not guilty. Still, when the jury left the courtroom to deliberate, the weight of the evidence was crushing. On October 18, 2021, the jury returned with its decision in the case of Aisha Agea. She was found guilty on all counts, including murder, evidence concealment, and tampering with physical evidence. On November 17, 2021, Justice Mario Mattei delivered sentencing for Michael Camerata. Michael, now fully convicted, stood to hear his fate. The judge sentenced him to 23 years to life in prison. As for Aisha, she ultimately accepted a plea agreement in exchange for testifying and acknowledging her role. In November, she was sentenced to 7 to 9 years in prison. The direction of the investigation shifts dramatically toward the mountain. All focus now zeroes in on a key discovery: a sippy cup found by a hiker in the thick forest. After quick verification, it's confirmed to belong to Whitney's young niece. This seemingly small object becomes a critical lead. Authorities cordon off the immediate area and begin an intensive search. Within hours, another team, a mix of volunteers and law enforcement, stumbles upon more clues: tire impressions, shards of broken glass, and most disturbingly, a license plate registered to Whitney Heichel. Larch Mountain is not an easy place to reach. It's heavily wooded, remote, and at least a 40-minute drive from Gresham. Why would anyone go there? Why would Whitney's vehicle end up with signs pointing toward this mountain wilderness? Investigators rope off the area. Search and rescue expands their efforts. Oregon State forensics teams are brought in to document everything. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. In this documentary, we'll explore a true crime case and examine photos of Whitney Heichel, who was born in 1991 in Portland, Oregon. Whitney was raised in a place where the pace of life moved a little slower, where neighbors still knew each other's names, and where the values of faith, family, and consistency weren't just ideals. They were part of everyday life. Her childhood was shaped by structure and spiritual values. Her parents, Jim and Lori, were deeply involved in their faith, practicing as Jehovah's Witnesses. It was a belief system that emphasized service, humility, and commitment, and those ideas became cornerstones in Whitney's character. From a young age, she was soft-spoken and thoughtful, never the one to seek the spotlight. She wasn't interested in trends or social drama. She found comfort in routine and in the quiet, familiar rhythms of her life. Friends from school and the local congregation often described Whitney as calm and kind, someone who really listened when you spoke, who remembered the little things that mattered. Her kindness was not performative. It was consistent, present in the way she treated people, whether she knew them well or had just met them. Her smile was genuine, her energy gentle. She didn't need to raise her voice to be noticed. By the time Whitney was in her late teens, she was already focused on building a life grounded in reliability. She wasn't chasing ambition in the big city sense. She found meaning in day-to-day responsibilities, in being someone others could depend on. That was her version of success. In 2011, Whitney married Clint Heichel, a young man she had known for many years. Their relationship wasn't the result of whirlwind romance or dramatic circumstances. It was built on long-standing friendship, mutual respect, and shared values. Both in their early 20s, they were still figuring things out, but they had one thing most young couples often lack: stability. They shared a similar vision of life: simple, quiet, steady. They didn't need much. They found joy in the small things: a movie night at home, weekend walks, family dinners. They weren't in a rush. They just wanted time. They moved into a modest apartment in Gresham, a cozy place that suited them perfectly. No sprawling suburbs or flashy furniture, just a space that was theirs, filled with warmth, conversation, and future plans. They had talked about starting a family someday. Kids weren't in the picture just yet, but the idea was there, waiting patiently in the wings of their young marriage. Whitney worked at coffee shop, not because it was glamorous or high-paying, but because she genuinely enjoyed it. She liked the structure, the social interaction, and the sense of community that came with the job. It was more than coffee. It was connection. She got to know her regulars, remembered their orders, and often became a small, comforting part of their morning routine. She wasn't just clocking in and out. She was part of something. And that meant something to her. She'd worked there for years, steadily saving up, contributing to their shared goals, and carrying her fair share of the weight in their young marriage. Her co-workers appreciated her consistency. She didn't gossip or get involved in drama. She showed up, did her job, and did it well. Whitney's world was intentionally small, but full. She stayed close with her parents, checking in regularly, making time for them despite her busy schedule. Her social circle wasn't large, but the connections she did have were meaningful. There was no history of conflict, no burned bridges or unresolved issues. If she had concerns, she kept them private. If she had struggles, she worked through them quietly. There were no warning signs, no ominous undercurrents, at least not on the surface. What made Whitney so deeply cherished by those who knew her? Her warmth, her openness, her unwavering trust in others, may also have been the very things that left her most exposed. She didn't live her life consumed by suspicion or fear. Instead, she embraced each day with optimism, firmly rooted in the belief that people were inherently good. She was someone who looked for the best in everyone. And more often than not, she found it. Tuesday, October 16th, 2012. Gresham, Oregon. The day began like countless others in the small suburban town nestled on the outskirts of Portland. Autumn had fully arrived, painting the landscape in rich, fiery tones: crimson, rust, deep golden yellow. The world, at first glance, was quiet and ordinary. Peaceful. By 6:45 a.m., the stillness was gently broken by the sound of a front door creaking open. Whitney Heichel, just 21 years old, stepped outside into the chilled October air. She pulled her sweater tighter against her frame, her breath briefly visible as a puff of white mist. In one hand, she held the keys to her workplace. Over her shoulder, her everyday tote bag rested, filled with essentials. Her black Ford Explorer stood faithfully in the driveway, dew beating on its windows. Inside the apartment, her husband, Clint, was just starting his own morning routine. Whitney leaned in, shared a quick but loving goodbye kiss, an exchange that had become second nature between them. It was brief, sweet, and, by all accounts, perfectly normal. There was no reason to believe anything was amiss. There were no signs, no warning. What Clint couldn't have known, what no one could have imagined, is that this mundane gesture, this quiet moment of affection, would become the final time he ever saw his wife leave the house. Whitney drove off, as she always did, toward her job as a barista at a local coffee shop just a few minutes away. She wasn't just good at her job, she took real pride in it. Her co-workers often described her as the kind of person who could light up a room just by walking in. She was reliable, organized, and always early. Not because she had to be, but because it mattered to her. She valued consistency, and she respected other people's time. As the clock neared 7 a.m., her co-workers were already inside the store, prepping for the morning rush. Machines hissed with steam, pastries were being arranged behind the glass, and the scent of roasted beans filled the air. Early customers trickled in, wrapped in scarves and still shaking off sleep. But amidst the hum of routine, something didn't feel quite right. By 7:05 a.m., Whitney still hadn't shown up. It was unusual, but not enough to cause alarm. Maybe she got stuck at a red light, or her car wouldn't start. These things happen. But when 7:15 rolled around with no word, heads began to turn. Texts were sent, no replies. A few calls were made, each one rolling straight to voicemail. Now people were frowning, glancing at the door, wondering aloud if she was okay. By 7:30 a.m., genuine concern had set in. The team knew Whitney. She wasn't the type to flake, and she certainly wouldn't just disappear without letting someone know. It wasn't her nature. Her absence wasn't just strange. It felt wrong. Meanwhile, back at home, Clint was also growing increasingly anxious. He had tried calling Whitney several times already. Each call met with that same unsettling silence. Her phone didn't ring. No texts, no updates. Just that hollow tone that goes straight to voicemail. By 8 a.m., worry had fully replaced routine. He paced. He dialed again, and again. The gut feeling, one people often describe as inexplicable but undeniable, was creeping in fast and heavy. But as the minutes ticked by, something had already occurred. Something no one in Whitney's life could have known yet. Roughly 9 miles away, in the nearby town of Troutdale, a security camera at a gas station quietly recorded what would soon become a key piece of evidence. At 9:11 a.m., a black Ford Explorer pulled up to one of the pumps. It was Whitney's vehicle, unmistakably hers. But it wasn't Whitney behind the wheel. A man was driving. The footage showed him exiting the vehicle casually. He had dark hair and an average build, nothing particularly striking at first glance. In the passenger seat, partially obscured by glare on the window, sat Whitney. Her expression was hard to read, but it was unmistakably her. She wasn't driving. She wasn't alone. The man used Whitney's debit card to pay for the gas, an action that, on the surface, might appear mundane. But it wasn't. It was deeply troubling. Whitney didn't loan out her car, and she certainly didn't let strangers use her bank cards. Something was wrong. Just 12 minutes later, at exactly 9:23 a.m., that same debit card was used again, this time at a nearby ATM. The surveillance there captured only a partial image, but it confirmed the transaction. Again, Whitney wasn't the one at the machine. Someone was using her accounts, but she wasn't contacting anyone. Not her husband, not her job, not her friends. Back at the apartment, Clint was now gripped by panic. It was now well past the time Whitney should have been at work. The silence, the lack of any contact, it didn't make sense. Whitney didn't just vanish. She wasn't that kind of person. By 10 a.m., he made a decision. He picked up the phone and called 911. "My wife's missing," Clint told the dispatcher. His voice was tight, trying to hold back the rising fear. "She left the house around 6:45 this morning to go to work. She never made it there." He gave them everything he could: her full name, description, the make and model of her car, the direction she usually took, and how long they'd been married, less than 2 years. This wasn't a case of someone skipping town. This was someone who had everything to live for, suddenly gone without a trace. The 911 call was logged at 10:02 a.m., and local police immediately launched a missing persons investigation. Officers began canvassing her typical commute, reaching out to coffee shop and checking for traffic or surveillance footage. Clint's call didn't just raise concern. It initiated the first wave of a search. They weren't saying much to the media, but behind closed doors, there was worry. A lot of it. Clint spoke to reporters that day, voice shaking with emotion. "And so, I'm still processing it. I don't even know what to think about it. I just hope she's okay. We're doing the best we can to, locate her," I hope nothing has happened to her. Clint's call sets the wheels turning, but the real break comes around 1 p.m. The one of those moments investigators both dread and depend on. Late Tuesday afternoon, a discovery is made that shifts the investigation from a missing persons case to something far more serious. Whitney's black Ford Explorer is found, abandoned in the parking lot of a wood village, a commercial hub just a few miles northeast of her home in Gresham. At first glance, it looks like just another vehicle in the sea of cars outside the busy shopping center. But a closer look reveals something far more unsettling. The passenger side window is shattered, glass scattered in a loose fan across the asphalt. The inside of the vehicle is disheveled. The back seats have been folded down, and the tires are coated with fresh mud. Not dried or days old, but wet, streaked with debris, like the SUV had recently been off-road or driven through a forest trail. This was not how Whitney kept her vehicle. Friends and family confirm she was tidy, particular. Someone else had clearly been inside the car, someone who didn't care much for appearances or evidence, and that someone didn't bother to cover their tracks. Meanwhile, miles away in the opposite direction, another thread appears in the growing web of clues. On Larch Mountain, a vast, rugged wilderness located about 20 miles east of Gresham, a hiker comes across something peculiar during a routine trail walk. Lying just off the path, half hidden in the underbrush, is a small object. Bright pink. A sippy cup. It's out of place in this dense forested area where only experienced hikers and campers tend to tread. The cup is clean, free of dirt or leaf litter, which suggests it hasn't been there long. It doesn't belong in the woods, and yet, there it is. At the time, the hiker doesn't recognize its significance. But later, investigators will confirm the cup belongs to Whitney's niece. It had been in Whitney's SUV just days before, a small, seemingly insignificant item, but one that now serves as a breadcrumb, a marker that something or someone had passed through here. A cup on a lonely trail, a bright splash of color in an otherwise grim puzzle. By mid-afternoon, word is spreading. The situation is no longer private. Her parents, Jim and Lori, and her younger sister, Chelsea. They had spoken with her just the day before. Everything seemed normal. Plans had been made for later in the week. There was no hint of trouble. Now they're on the phone with Clint, who is barely able to hold it together as he explains that Whitney never made it to work, that her phone has been off for hours, that the SUV is no longer where it should be. The shock is instant. And from that moment on, the family rallies together. The local congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses, where Whitney had been active since childhood, quickly mobilizes. Members begin printing flyers, hundreds of them. They work with speed and precision, spreading the word through neighborhoods, gas stations, and shopping centers. The flyers carry her photo, age, and last known whereabouts. Missing Whitney Heichel, 21 years old. Last seen Tuesday, October 16th. They're posted on storefronts, telephone poles, and handed out to passers-by. Community members begin calling in any detail they can recall, no matter how small. But as the day wears on, a quiet dread begins to settle in. By 3 p.m., hours have passed since Whitney vanished. And with each hour, the concern deepens. Law enforcement doesn't hesitate. They recognize the urgency. The Gresham Police Department pulls together a coordinated response, drawing in additional resources from surrounding jurisdictions. 24 detectives are assigned to the case, coming in from Multnomah County, Troutdale, Fairview, and the Oregon State Police. The State Crime Lab is placed on standby. Forensic units are dispatched directly to the parking lot to begin collecting evidence from the abandoned SUV. Every minute counts. Police Chief Craig Junginger addresses the situation head-on. From the beginning, he classifies it as a potential criminal investigation, not a misunderstanding, not a voluntary disappearance. The signs are too clear. A broken window, a suspicious ATM withdrawal, a missing woman who never deviated from her routine. Time is of the essence, and everyone involved knows it. But law enforcement isn't the only force at work. The Jehovah's Witnesses community, already printing and distributing flyers, begins organizing search teams. Volunteers of all ages show up. Friends, neighbors, people who barely knew Whitney but felt compelled to help. By noon, they've canvassed the area surrounding her apartment and fanned out to nearby parks, trails, and commercial zones. It's one of these teams that helps lead investigators to the parking lot, confirming that her explorer hadn't been there all morning. It had appeared sometime between 10 and 11 a.m. Detectives quickly begin photographing the scene. They bag shards of glass, take tire impressions, and collect any personal belongings left inside the vehicle. Several items are also found in a nearby dumpster. Nothing dramatic or incriminating, just small, personal things that don't belong in the trash. A compact mirror, a scarf. They're collected and logged, each one a possible clue. The gas station footage becomes the first real lead. At 9:14 a.m., a black SUV pulls into a gas station in Troutdale, Whitney's Ford Explorer. But she's not behind the wheel. She's visible in the passenger seat, and there's a man driving. His features aren't entirely clear. Dark hair, medium build, but enough detail is captured to know this isn't someone random. He's familiar with the vehicle. He uses Whitney's debit card to pay for gas. Investigators begin to ask the hard questions. Who is this man? How does he know her PIN? Did Whitney know him? Trust him? Was he a stranger or someone from her inner circle? Police begin digging into Whitney's day-to-day life. They knock on doors in her apartment complex, asking neighbors if they saw anything unusual that morning. Most say the same thing. Whitney was quiet, polite, always kept to herself. But one name comes up more than once. Someone from the neighborhood, known to a few residents. Not a suspect, but someone worth checking out. They head to coffee shop next. Her coworkers repeat what others have said. Whitney was always reliable, never late, never dramatic. No trouble at work, no complaints. Just a kind, steady presence. Friends and family reinforce that picture. No enemies, no recent changes in behavior, no reason to believe she would walk away from voluntarily. By Wednesday, October 17th, the investigation gains momentum. Police expand their search radius. New areas are added: Dodge Park, the city of Sandy, and more of the terrain around Larch Mountain. Search and rescue teams are called in. Volunteers retrace paths. K-9 units sweep the apartment complex and surrounding blocks, focusing especially on the stretch between the gas station and coffee shop. And then, the investigation turns sharply toward the mountain. The sippy cup found by the hiker, now confirmed to belong to Whitney's niece, becomes a priority. The area around it is flagged and combed. Within hours, another team, a mix of volunteers and law enforcement, stumbles upon more clues. Tire impressions, shards of broken glass, and most disturbingly, a license plate, registered to Whitney's Explorer. Larch Mountain is not an easy place to reach. It's heavily wooded, remote, and at least a 40-minute drive from Gresham. Why would anyone go there? Why would Whitney's vehicle end up with signs pointing toward this mountain wilderness? Investigators rope off the area. Search and rescue expands their efforts. Oregon State forensics teams are brought in to document everything. Thursday, October 18th, 2012. 4 days have passed since Whitney Heichel disappeared, and the story takes another unexpected turn. It begins innocently enough. Children playing outside an apartment complex in Troutdale, Oregon, about 1.5 miles from the gas station where Whitney's car was first spotted. They're running around after school, chasing one another through the shrubs near the edge of the apartments. That's when one of them spots something shiny tucked between two bushes. It's not a toy. It's a cell phone. What they don't realize at first is that this phone, battered, slightly dirty, but still functional, belongs to Whitney Heichel. The phone's screen lights up when touched. The lock screen shows a photo of Whitney smiling. Several unread messages appear on the display, some from friends, others from family, all asking variations of the same haunting question. Are you okay? Where are you? The discovery shakes the children's parents, who immediately report it to the police. Officers arrive quickly and collect the phone as evidence, logging its exact location and condition. It's not just a clue, it's a connection. The phone's placement is significant. It's situated roughly midway between the gas station and the parking lot where Whitney's SUV was found. That triangulation tightens the investigation's geographic net. Now they have a more focused zone to work with, one that could potentially include where she was taken, or where someone tried to cover their tracks. Earlier that same day, Whitney's mother, Laura I. Ritton-Miller, speaks publicly for the first time. Standing before local reporters and a crowd of supporters, she holds back tears as she describes her daughter, not just as a missing person, but as the light in her life. "She was the sunshine in my heart," Laura says, voice trembling. "She took care of everybody. She was thoughtful, loving. And I just want to say thank you to anyone helping us look for her. We're so grateful. Please don't stop searching." Nearby, Clint Heichel, Whitney's husband, stands at the podium, attempting to speak. But the words don't come. His grief is visible. He tries once, then again. But the pain overtakes him. With his head down and voice cracking, he steps back, unable to finish the sentence. It's a heartbreaking moment, raw, human, and real. But even as the family pleads for answers, someone unexpected steps forward. Jonathan Holt, a 24-year-old man who lives just a few doors down from Whitney and Clint at their Gresham apartment complex, walks into the police station. He isn't under arrest. He isn't a suspect, at least not yet. He tells officers that he's been deeply affected by the news, that he's worried, shaken, that he wants to help. Holt's appearance is casual. He's calm but visibly emotional. He tells detectives that on the morning of Tuesday, October 16th, the day Whitney disappeared, he was headed to work at a vending machine company in Portland when, according to him, 2 unidentified men robbed him on the way. He says he didn't report the incident to the police at the time because he was too distraught. Instead, he says, he walked around in shock, crying, unsure what to do. Detectives listen carefully. The timeline he gives is vague. His story contains gaps, details that don't quite add up. Why didn't he call 911? Why didn't he tell anyone? Why, of all people, would someone like him randomly show up to volunteer a strange story in the middle of a missing persons case involving his neighbor? Near the end of the interview, Holt makes an offhand comment that catches their attention. He says, "It's just bad timing. All this happening the same day as Whitney." He says it casually, but detectives take note. Something about his tone doesn't sit right. They ask him to provide fingerprints and a DNA sample. He agrees without hesitation. No resistance, no evasion. They let him go, for now. But they're watching closely. This development chills everyone involved. Family, friends, even strangers following the case. Because if Holt is involved, then Whitney's story doesn't involve some faceless stranger. It involves someone close. Someone who lived feet away. Someone who knew her. A neighbor. Someone who had every reason to be familiar, and no visible reason to be dangerous. Friday, October 19th. The dam finally breaks. In the morning hours, Jonathan Holt is spotted at his workplace in North Portland. Security cameras later confirm that he briefly stops near a bush outside the building. What he leaves behind is significant: a handgun. That same day, just before heading into the Gresham Police Department for a second round of questioning, Holt is caught on camera again, this time outside the station, tossing another firearm into a patch of grass. It's reckless, it's bold, and it's the final mistake detectives needed. The lab results from Whitney's SUV arrive that day. Holt's fingerprints and DNA are everywhere. On the steering wheel, the door handles, the gear shift. Confronted with the evidence, Holt doesn't argue. He confesses. Not with emotion, not with remorse, but plainly, like he's reading from a list. He admits that he drove Whitney east, that she was at Lake Roslyn. The details of his confession are held back from the public, but law enforcement confirms one thing: it was enough. The charges come swiftly. On Tuesday, October 23rd, Jonathan Holt appears in court. He's indicted on 19 counts, a sweeping list that includes aggravated murder, kidnapping, and multiple degrees of robbery. The reason for the high number is simple. This wasn't a single act of harm. It was a sequence of deliberate decisions, one step after another, each leading deeper into tragedy. So, who was Jonathan Holt really? Born in 1988 and raised in Gresham, he was no outsider. He was a local, a neighbor, married, no children, employed. His life looked ordinary on paper. He and Whitney attended the same hall, participated in the same community functions. They saw each other regularly at congregation meetings. Nothing about him stood out. But co-workers would later tell police something else. Something subtle but telling. Holt could be distant. Not aggressive, not alarming, but disconnected. A bit off. Quiet in a way that wasn't just shy, but withdrawn. He had no prior criminal record, no history, no legal red flags. But something had clearly been simmering beneath the surface for a long time. To this day, Holt has never given a motive. No feud, no explanation. Just silence. A decision made in a moment that destroyed a life and fractured many others. After the arrest, Holt's family remains silent. His wife, stunned by the revelations, moves out of their apartment almost immediately. She declines to speak to the media. No statements, no defense, just distance. As Holt sits in jail, awaiting trial, the community begins to process what's happened. For the Heichel family, the pain is still fresh, but so is the love pouring in. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers come forward to offer their condolences, their support, and their time. The family decides to organize a public memorial, not just as a way to say goodbye, but to give the community a place to come together and grieve as one. Local businesses step up, donating food, flowers, chairs, and space for the event. People bring candles, photos, handmade signs. It becomes more than a service. I know I won't be able to say thank you to every single person, Clint Heichel said, standing quietly in front of the local news cameras. His voice was steady, but the strain behind it was unmistakable. Pain held just beneath the surface. But I'm going to try my best, because they deserve a thanks. He was speaking not just to reporters, but to a city that had wrapped its arms around him after the most unimaginable loss of his life. Nearly 9 months had passed since Whitney Heichel, his wife, his best friend, the person he built a life with, was taken from him in the most senseless and heartbreaking way. The grief hadn't faded. It had deepened. Each day without her was another reminder of what had been stolen. It's obviously been tough, Clint admitted. I'm trying to take it one day at a time, but it's very hard because we were very much in love. He didn't have to explain further. Anyone who knew them could see it. Whitney and Clint were inseparable, not just husband and wife, but true partners. Soulmates in the quiet, ordinary way that means the most. It's very hard for me to be at my apartment, he added, eyes lowered, and have her not doing her little thing. That little thing might have been the way she hummed in the mornings, or how she always left notes on the fridge, those tiny rituals that define a shared life and become deafening in their absence. It's July 8th, 2013, nearly 9 months to the day since Whitney vanished. And inside a Clackamas County courtroom, a man named Jonathan Holt, the same neighbor who once claimed to be shaken up and willing to help, is finally about to face justice. Holt wasn't unknown. He wasn't a shadowy stranger lurking in alleyways. He was someone Whitney and Clint saw regularly, someone they said hello to, someone who shared their building, their community, even their faith. The question in court that day wasn't about guilt. Holt had already confessed to law enforcement in chilling detail. The facts weren't in dispute. The question now was about what came next, what kind of accountability would be handed down, and whether the weight of the justice system could begin to balance the unbearable loss suffered by Whitney's loved ones. There was no high-stakes trial, no drawn-out legal battle, no months of procedural wrangling or dramatics in front of a jury. Holt's legal team made a decision early on. He would plead guilty. He would not contest the charges. For Whitney's family, it was a bitter blessing. Avoiding a public trial spared them the trauma of reliving the worst days of their lives on the witness stand. But it didn't undo what had already happened. The hearing itself was brief, just under an hour, but for everyone in that courtroom, those 50 minutes held a weight that felt impossible to describe. Years of heartbreak condensed into moments. Holt entered the courtroom with his shoulders slumped, flanked on either side by his two defense attorneys. His once longer hair was now unkempt, and he kept his eyes fixed on the floor throughout most of the proceeding. He said little. When he did speak, his words were low, halting, and without elaboration. He pled guilty to 3 of the 19 charges filed against him: aggravated murder, first-degree kidnapping, and first-degree robbery. Just those 3 counts alone were enough to guarantee he'd never walk free again. The sentence was firm, final, and without ambiguity. Life in prison without the possibility of parole.